good at this. I like to walk. Okay, I'll stand here. Can I welcome you to this new series for the Trinity term on populism and science. I'm Sarah Harper. I'm the founding director of the Oxford Institute of Population Ageing, and it's part of our 20-year celebrations because we were founded in 1998. So 2018 is our 20th year. And we are delighted that we were able to join with the Oxford Martin School to form their Trinity seminar series. We joined the Martin School as one of their institutes in 2005 and have been a member since then. In a minute I will introduce our speaker, but I just wanted to talk a little bit about the concept behind the series, because this is a series which is going to run over the next 6 weeks, and we very much hope that many people will come and engage with the series. For all sorts of reasons. One, because it makes the debate more exciting, but also because out of this series we hope to publish a book on populism and science, and your conversation and the discussion and debate that we have during the discussion time will be very, very important in informing some of the thinking behind that. And now I must tell you that this is all being recorded and it's also being live streamed. So if you don't want to be recorded or live streamed, then I'm afraid please just don't ask a question, because it'll be impossible to edit you out. So, but hopefully you'll be very happy to take part in the debate. I think maybe one of the things we should talk about is populism and science. Why Institute of Population Ageing? Why have we chosen this, and why now? One of the things when we founded the Institute in 1998 was that we really believed that we needed to do very high-level empirical research which informed and was informed by policy and practice. And in fact, at the end of the 90s, we were very clearly doing something which nowadays is called public engagement, or the public understanding of science. Public engagement with research didn't really exist then, but we're part of a growing group of academics who, over the last 2 or 3 decades, have increasingly wanted to engage directly with policymakers and with the public. And when you look at the kind of research that we do at the Institute around longevity, around comorbidities, around reproductive health at the other end of the life spectrum, it forms part of that really important set of academic or research questions which have huge policy implications, but also, and more importantly, it's where science and the public really come together. The kind of longevity research we're talking about is having 10 million people living today who will make it to a century. It is talking about maybe extending life expectancies to over 100, but actual life maybe beyond 120 to 130. It's linking in with the people here who look at things like transhumanism and saying, well, if we're going to have real science affecting longevity, are we still going to be human? It's questions around reproduction at the other end, questions around Alzheimer's disease, and around the kind of decisions, all decisions where science and policy and the public come together. And why now? Well, I'm sure we're all aware why now. We only have to look, I'm not going to talk about Iran, but we only have to look at climate change and the fact that obviously we now live in a world where science that is very much endorsed by a raft of respectable scientists can be overturned and talked about as being false by some of our politicians. This is the time when I think scientists are facing some of their biggest challenges, and we also are seeing a rise of a different type of populism. So this series won't really look at populism per se, although we are going to have Robin Niblett from Chatham House, who's going to come and talk to us about governance in an era of populism. But this idea of what populism is and how it interacts with scientists, and when I say scientists, it is researchers, experts, economists and arts people will also be included. We have a talk by the director of the Ashmolean, for example, at the end of the series. That kind of interaction and what it means to be a scientist in today's world. And before I hand over to Andrea, I just wanted to give you 2 quotes which I think really sort of struck home when I was thinking about how to talk about populism. In some of the recent writings we've had, it says that populism has had a long history, but populism is when there is support and facilitation for the rights and power of the people in their struggle against the expert. well, I'm sure, in fact, expert was often meant also to be politician, but expert is now in that definition of what populism can be. And in particular, it is an opportunity to empathise with the public through rhetoric and unrealistic proposals. And you only have to think of Trump and Brexit and everything we're going through to understand that we are living in a very special time. So this series is going to look at science and populism through a spectrum. We're going to start in a minute with Andrea, who works for the Cabinet Office, and so this is very much a sort of political policy view. We will be moving on next week to look at give a lecture by Fiona Fox, who works for the Science Media Centre, about getting real science into the press. We have someone from the Framework Institute, which is a private body who is trying to help us understand how we can take scientific evidence and in very different ways be able to communicate it in a way that is sympathetic to, if you like, a populist agenda, but in the right sense. And then, as I say, we have Robin Niblett, who's going to be talking about governance. And we have two wonderful panels, Emily Wilson, who is the new editor of The New Scientist, and Catherine Matheson from the British Science Association, and then three people from our museums, Roger Highfield from the Science Museum, and the director of the Ashmolean and of the Natural History Museum here in Oxford, to round it up and talk about the experience of communicating real science in today's world. So I just want to end with one example, because I think this is a really good example of how we can start to disentangle some of these ideas. And it is what was in the press, I think it was last week, about the breast cancer scandal, the missing breast scans. And we had things like 270 women died as a result of missed breast scans. We didn't know anything about these 270 women. And over the week, we have had a lot of scientists taking part in this debate and pointing out that actually these are women who missed their last scan, age 69 to about 70. And as a consequence, it raises questions like, why 70, why not 71? It raises questions about things to do with the fact that if you have 10 women being scanned, possibly 3 of those will be misscanned, or will have tumours that would never have developed, and therefore will have unnecessary treatment. There's some really interesting stories in there, but from our point of view, it actually links the seminar together, because it says, why was it that the Department of Health announced 270? And we've actually had some colleagues desperately trying to do some modelling to try and work out where did this 270 figure come from. And I'm sure, and in fact I know the Science Media Centre tried really hard to get sensible journalism, and yet it was this headline, 270 women have died because of missing breast scans. What about getting the data across? How is it that we can present this data, which is very complicated and nuanced, to a population? And what about the role of our science organisations in enabling real deep understanding of some of the issues? So I thought that was a very nice sort of motif which actually describes what we're trying to achieve over the next 6 weeks. But now we must get on and introduce our first speaker, and Andrea Siodmok, who I met only recently at a Cabinet Office meeting, has very, very kindly agreed to come and talk to us about working for the Cabinet Office and her work with the Policy Lab. She was formerly the Chief Design Officer at the Design Council, and she's currently head of the UK Government Policy Lab, and she's Deputy Director at the Cabinet Office. She has written and spoken extensively about policy and about design, and she was appointed a member of the European Commission's Design Leadership Board, and her latest book, I think, is called Design for Growth and Prosperity.
It's linked to that.
It's linked, yes. So, okay. So, Andrea is going to talk to us about the art of the possible. So perhaps we can thank Andrea.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you for coming tonight. It's a pleasure to be here. The good news, as Sarah said at the start, is that 100 million Brits alive today will make it to 100 years. But the real question that is facing policymakers is about what kind of world will we all live in at that time? And what kind of decisions might we make right now that will start to shape that world in the future? And in many ways, and the example I'm going to share with you is really about asking that question. Not just what would the world be like for people who are older, the centennials, but also for younger people living in a society which has more older people. And of course, this is not just a UK challenge, this is also a global challenge in the way that we live. And one of the questions is not so much the extending of people's life, but the extending of people's quality of life and how it feels to live in that world. So I'm going to talk more broadly about the work that we do in the Policy Lab, but I'm also going to pick out a particular case study around the future of ageing. And as Sarah said, I'm somewhat a hybrid, I think, in that my original degree was industrial design. So I studied on the same course that Johnny Ive. So any of you who have iPhones or Mac computers, I studied that course. And then I did a PhD in virtual reality, looking at the frontiers of digital world and the art of the possible there. And then more recently, doubling back, if you like, to do a master's in public policy at the London School of Economics. And I mention that because a lot of the work that we do in the Policy Lab is about the bringing together of different worlds. It's the intersection, if you like, between different professions and different toolkits. And again, you'll see a little bit of that in the presentation. So we're based here, not the telephone box. The building to the left of it is the Treasury, and the Cabinet Office has a base on the 4th floor there. And you'll see, obviously, Parliament there and Big Ben without its scaffolding. So really the centre of government. And I think that the team that I work in is about showcasing and demonstrating new ways of working, cutting-edge practice, if you like. And we have to make a judgment about what cutting edge is, because sometimes that turns into bleeding edge if you go a little bit too far. And so for us, it's often about what is the art of the possible and what is acceptable. So you have actually seen The Office. If you're a James Bond fan, they filmed Spectre. So Daniel Craig walks through, this is the inner drum. So as the helicopters fly over for the evening shots for the news, you often see this drum. And as civil servants, we can have selfies taken walking the steps of Daniel Craig. What was curious to me, though, was when they made the film, they didn't choose our interior of our office. So they used the outside, and yet when they went for the interior shots, they created a stage set. And, I don't know about you, but that looks nothing like my desk. So there's something about the characterization, if you like, of the civil service, which is probably a little bit out of kilter with the times that we're actually living in now. So if nothing else, I want to debunk any stereotypes you might have picked up about what it's like to be in the civil service. To show you what our office looks like, it's much more like this. So this is some work we did with the Department for Trade, working with Francis Maud. So this is a minister working in a user-centred way, putting the citizens' needs in the forefront of our thinking and the needs of business, working with post-it notes. You just can't imagine somehow Daniel Craig in his James Bond with post-it notes hanging out of the water cooler in an open plan office. It just isn't Bond. So sometimes it's probably a surprise. You may have walked past this building and not necessarily know what's gone on inside. As I say, we work in all different departments, and we're all about change. We're all about how do you create the kind of change, create the kind of society that we want to live in. And for me, this is a mixture of lots of dynamics. And I'm going to come on throughout the talk to some of the crucial dynamics. Sarah mentioned data. That's a fundamental part of the dynamics of policymaking, evidence, and how you curate and curate that data. But really, let's not forget that we have institutions. They're really important. They're part of the political life. And there is the art of politics itself. So I'm a civil servant, and therefore I don't involve myself greatly in the politics, but I am very involved in the craft of policy and policy making and bringing new thinking to that space. But over the decades, we've seen much more of an emergence also of the science of management and new public management, for example. So there are techniques borrowed perhaps from the private sector and the pragmatics of delivery. And so success in this world, if you like, is a combination of these different dynamics. And I started with the talk title, The Art of the Possible. Well, this was von Bismarck, who said it's not the best solution or the optimum solution. It's the one you can deliver. It's the one you can make happen. And in order to make it happen, you have to understand the relationship between these different elements. So a little starter for 10 here. So just around the corner from the office, this is a photo I took in Soho. And you'll see that the first parking bay here says doctor. The second parking bay says disabled. The question I'd just like to pose to you is, what does the third parking space say? So we know that Soho, central London, high premium for parking. There's not enough to go around, so our supply and demand on that is skewed. How do we make a judgment about that last parking space? So this is where you get to interact. Any thoughts on the third parking space? What might it be? Carpool. It could be, yeah. I mean, we take up great swathes of road here and overseas in terms of car sharing. It's not. That isn't the answer. What was? So it is. It's electric car. What was the one at the back? You don't want to say now. So it is electric cars. And I think this picture, for me, personifies what it's like when policy hits the ground and the lived experience. Because clearly these things aren't equal. Someone's had to make a judgment. And there may be other priorities that we collectively might wish to have. Of course, if you are a disabled doctor driving an electric car, you've got three to choose from. So the example I'm going to share with you is about the future of ageing, as I mentioned at the start. And I want to share it with you because, for me, this work that we've been doing is really at the forefront of thinking. I know no other government in the world that is applying this kind of thinking in the early stage of policy making. So it's quite groundbreaking, and it's a really exciting project. And the Policy Lab set about on this project to work with the government's Office for Science. And when we think about ageing, when we think about many of the things that are going to affect us in the future, we tend to perhaps think of an extension of the present. You walk backwards, if you like, into the future. And I use this example from a book recently called Speculative Everything, just to make the point that the future isn't a direct line. It's not an obvious path from where we are today. There are many possible futures. There are probable futures, plausible and preferable. So where on this spectrum should we be exploring? And I think there's a slightly different mindset from that which is more analytical to one which is much more exploratory, which probably sits behind a lot of what I'm going to talk about. And this work has come, the speculative design work has come from the Royal College of Art, some work research by Dunn and Raby, which we've been, if you like, applying in a government setting. So from academia, building new thinking, and then us testing it in policy. And the Government Office of Science, you may well know, I know Sarah does, did a review of the latest and the best evidence. So these are evidence reviews, and this is from a government website. It lists all of the research and analysis that was done across many different meetings with leading experts across the country and beyond. And it covered everything from health and social care through to life expectancy, transport, emotional, personal resilience, a comprehensive, a phenomenal amount of work. So 18 months of research, a 200,000-word report. The challenge was that some policymakers weren't reading it. And so the risk, if you like, is policy continues down a path despite the evidence. So the Government Office for Science asked us to work with them to find new ways to bring this evidence to life, particularly for policymakers who are very focused on their here and now and often focused on their particular policy area. This was about big picture thinking, and it was about future thinking, both of which are, crucially important, but we were trying out new tools. So what we did is we took the evidence, the 200,000 words, and we broke it down into these evidence cards, and we turned it into a workshop so that different policy leads from different parts of government could come together and they could curate their own evidence, start to build their own evidence safari. And these created evidence stations around a room, not dissimilar to here, where you could go and interrogate different evidence. And I put the picture there on the left, using personas, so real life examples of people who would live in this world. And again, all of this came from the evidence. So these aren't hypothetical people. They are evidence from the data. And so we give them names. You can say, what would Laura think? And after a while, when you do this kind of workshop, you do genuinely feel like you know this person. And you can test your policy, whether Ben would like it or not, or how would it affect someone's life. So through these sessions, we were also able to look at the whole system and do some mapping there. And then we took it forward, one step forward from the evidence into the kind of so what question. So what next? We know what the issues are, what we're going to do. And this is where we brought in some of the design thinking methodology, which we borrow from the private sector. So when James Dyson creates a new vacuum cleaner, he will prototype it. He will do thousands of prototypes. And the challenge for policymakers is how many policies will go through that same level of prototyping. So we thought we would do that in this case and start to build some speculations of the future. And this is one of them. So I shared two, but this is one. So this is a virtual reality, if you like, simulation from the future, built from the evidence, so built from the 200,000-word report, about an environment. And I don't know so what you can see here, but this is a counter. It's a shop from the future. It's a robot repair shop. So the what if here is, instead of going and getting your shoes fixed at Timpson's, perhaps you go to this repair shop to get your AI fixed on your robot. What would that be like? So we call these prototypes, not prototypes, but prototypes. They're there to provoke, to create a reaction, and that's new data for us. And so here we were testing it with various people to get their feedback on what the world might be like if we created this. I haven't got a picture, but we also did a simulation of Manchester, an intersection of transport for the future, and it was really interesting taking it out to meet with the public, because they found things we never designed, we never put in the visualization. And one of the groups said, well, it must be the future. And we said, why? And they said, it's not raining, it's Manchester. Climate change must have happened. And we had to explain it was just really hard to render rain. It costs more in computer power to get the kind of raindrops and the little shadows and so on. So we didn't design that bit in, but it was still a provocation. So we were able to get quite rich data about that future and feed that back into the policy process. And so from this work and other work, I'd like to, we kind of generalize, if you like, across some of the projects. And this diagram came from, originally from Gartner and then adapted to some of the work that we're doing about what I think of as the difference between best practice, so what has already happened and is proven, and next practice, the things we don't know yet, where the speculative nature of design and policymaking can exist. So on the left-hand side, if I just walk you through, I know there's lots of words on here, but we have things like hindsight, so what happened, the descriptive analytics, the data, if you like, that you might make decisions from, to what is happening, and investigative analytics. So this is oversight, when you have a dashboard or some other kind of metrics that you're controlling the system perhaps, or steering, incentivizing your system, into, as we move up, this kind of higher order, if you like, of complexity and ambiguity. Why did it happen? So a lot of the empirical methods you might use, like regression analysis and going back over to look and better understand what happened in that circumstance, and therefore might it happen again. And then we get into the future a little bit more, which is what will happen. And this is why I was saying before, it's like walking backwards into the future, that often our processes and our methods as best practice are drawing on the past. But what if the future is very, very different? And of course, science fiction, science fact, many of the technologies we use readily today, many people wouldn't have predicted. And so therefore, we have to have a sense of the unknown as well as the known. So this gets us into foresight, which I know many people are very familiar with, and government has a foresight unit, forecasting and scenarios, and then finally into this kind of top right corner of outsight. And this is the space where that project came from, which is really about how can we make it happen? How can we start with the data, build a prototype, and then put it in the world and start to make it happen? So it moves it much more into probably the comfort zone of the design and creative sector, but in combination with science. So again, this mix and hybrid. And I indicate along the bottom here some of the tools and techniques that are associated with these. And as I say, speculative design is brand new to government, and I know of no other government in the world that are doing that. The lab exists to test that, to just work out, is this technique going to work? And if it does, we scale it across the 17,000 policymakers in government. But of course, it might not work. We're trying things for the first time, in which case either we adapt them or we don't use them. So I've got a few slides here, really, just to give you a little bit of the theory that sits behind some of the work that we're doing, and in particular around design thinking. And it builds on what I was saying before about a shift from an intelligent choice-based model based on past data to one that is more about stewardship and about choice in a people-centered way looking forwards. And it allows things to kind of emerge much more. So this is some work that was done by UNDP. It's a fantastic report. If you're interested in design thinking and public service, I wholeheartedly recommend this report. But in summary, they bring forth the importance of being people-centered. I know that is very much the rhetoric both of business and of the public sector. Taking a comprehensive approach and connecting synergies and doing these reality checks. And that's where a lot of the techniques that I was describing are about those reality checks. And in doing so, it's much more adaptive. It's much more fluid. So what does that mean? If you've read Roger Martin's work from Rotman Business School, he talks about moving from mystery to heuristic to algorithm. Mystery is like, we don't know what the future is. We're in the fog. The fuzzy front end, some people call it. Heuristic is, well, let's do some best guesses. Let's put some things out there in the world and see what sticks into the algorithm. And I think he famously drew an analogy with the moving from Big Mac to chicken nuggets. How can you create a meal that you can eat in the car easily? Cut a long story short, the answer was chicken nuggets. But what McDonald's really do well is they create the algorithm, and then they scale that across the whole system. And governments and large organizations are really good at algorithm-style thinking and less well adept at mystery thinking, and that brings a whole new skill set. Same point, but made slightly differently, would be Nigel Cross's work about what he calls the co-evolution of the problem space and the solution space. So if you follow the beautifully visualized diagram here, the idea is that you don't come up with a solution in the absence of experience. You start to build a better understanding of the problem by putting solutions in it. So it's back to that heuristics. And you create a feedback loop. So the problem informs the theory, and the theory informs the practice. And that in itself becomes so in modern terms, I guess, in digital terms, you'd call this agile. So this is about embracing ambiguity and not being comfortable with uncertainty. And it's also about being willing to put something out there in the world that is a best guess. And this isn't always easy for government and policymakers. But the alternative is not to try out new things and not to experiment. And the problem with that really dampens the ability for government to innovate. To give you an example, this is some work we did with the police, Surrey and Sussex Police, so this police commissioner. And this was the start of the morning at the Institute for Government. And everyone was pretty excited. It might not be apparent in the photo, but there was an energy in the room. But they were up for a normal meeting, you know. And by the afternoon, we'd brought into play some physical making about what the future might be. And it even went so far as to someone pretending to be robbed outside Buckingham Palace. And we realised that our criminologist professors might inadvertently, through prototyping, invoke real police to come, and it all got a bit circular. But the mindset shift was really crucial here. And as a result of this work, we were able to save 180,000 hours of police time, £3.7 million per year for the police. By thinking about the problem in new ways, coming at it from the citizen's point of view, and understanding as a victim of crime, how do you want to report, as opposed to as a system, how would it best suit you? And I think we've all experienced that in many ways, where our systems are designed around the providers. The algorithm, the efficiency is around the provider and not around the citizen experience. And those who do it well have understood they need to shift. A couple more examples of these best guesses, these heuristics. This is some work we did on national insurance cards, and some of you will have received a card when you got your national insurance number, and some of you won't. There was a decision made, cost saving, to revert to a letter. One of the challenges of that is that people lost the letters. I still have the card with my very first signature on it, which is quite embarrassing, but at the time I felt very grown up. But that was my first moment, my first touch point with the state, and today some young people just don't have that. They throw away the letter and they don't really. So here we were prototyping, just with a bit of foam board, what might a new interface be like, a new way of receiving your national insurance number, and also we could then test it with young people and get them to co-design it with us, which was brilliant. Had some amazing ideas. Here's another project. We have to put a disclaimer on these. These are not government proposals yet. But there's something about the prototype has to be believable, but it's also good to have it a bit rough and ready. If it's too believable, people assume they can't change it. Whereas, so Sanjan here did this work, where we were looking at the private rental sector and how tenants' rights are upheld. I don't know how many of you know whether tenants or landlords are responsible for your smoke detectors. That was one of the things we were testing. And so really, to kind of draw it to a close, this new way of thinking, if you like, of using heuristics, mixing together different disciplines, and prototyping is very different from the more empirical best practice approach that you might see with, say, randomized controlled trials. And so the work, we had a visiting fellow, Professor Lucy Kimball, join us for a year in the lab. And this is one of the learnings that she drew from her work with us, which is that we basically work in very different ways to the traditional empirical method, using abductive thinking, building confidence, having many variables, not few, the holistic, and really using the lens of the lived experience. And so a lot of the work that we do, we actually work with ethnographers who can go and spend time with people. So our work on homelessness, for example, involved spending time with homeless people to really understand some of their risk factors and also some of their resilience that perhaps was overlooked. We're doing the same at the moment on employment support allowance and many social issues. So the key thing here, I think, is it's quite low expertise and low investment in time and resources. In a way, this is where you get this sort of slightly tired phrase, fail fast. But there is, of course, some truth in that, which is it's better to fail fast than fail slowly. So there's something about getting it wrong early and not being so wedded to it and it not being so crucial that you can learn. And I think above all else, this is about embedding a learning culture within policy making that is both open to embracing innovation, but is also open to embracing some of the learning that can come from failure. Christian Basson sums this up in the book I co-wrote with him, he edited it and I wrote a chapter, as the sense-making public manager, a real shift from that new public management I said before, and he speaks incredibly articulately about why that is different and why it's important now. I finish with some of the more recent work that we've been looking at, linking back, if you like, to the art of the possible. So government can do so much, but actually, as we know, change happens in very complex, sometimes small and very big ways across the whole system, a mixed economy. So one of the things that we've been looking at, and it's slightly faded at the top, but the difference between some of the more obvious tools that a policymaker might use, like law and regulation, through to convening power, influencing, and stewardship. So recognizing that some of the things perhaps at the bottom of this list are quite slow, whereas some things you can actually change quite quickly. Now, my favorite example of this was Mike Bracken and the Government Digital Service. He said they put through Parliament a request, if you like, to allow the public to download their tax data onto CD-ROMs. But the problem was, by the time it went through Parliament, no one was using CD-ROMs. And so we have to have these choices about the kinds of levers, the kinds of intervention, the kinds of action that government might take that fit with the modern, fast-paced world we live in. So if you take that list from light touch government to fundamentally a government process, we've looked at 28 levers for change, and this is still work in progress. But we just thought it was quite helpful. So when we go to policy teams, we say, where are you on this? You know, are you in the choice architecture of behavioural insights, or the convening power of having a prime minister or a president standing on the steps of their parliament? Or perhaps you're an innovator and you're using government's procurement and buying powers to drive a new market. There are many ways that government can act, and we wanted to kind of lay that out. And so we've turned these into a toolkit, and this is some of the pictures, but we used it, I think probably 6 weeks ago now, on the future of shipping. So a 30-year horizon, autonomous shipping. We've all heard of autonomous cars. I didn't know, but there are such things as autonomous ships. And marine autonomy and AI in autonomy and automation will transform shipping in some way. And as with the aging challenge, the same thing is true. We don't know in what ways. So we use these techniques to start to help a whole set of people from across the system to think about that future. So if nothing else, I think a lot of our work is about taking what is often very, very complex. This is a map of the policymaker's world, and reducing it down to things that we can deal with. And I was always struck by a comment that was made about the private sector, where someone said, my organisation, a big global corporate, so my organisation is so complex, the only person who can truly understand it is the customer. And I think there is a parallel here with government and with the complexity of the mixed economy, whether it be the private or public sector, in trying to serve people. The most important thing is that we really understand what it's like to be the citizen, the recipient of that service, and open up our methods to support them. And that's me. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a fantastic sort of overview of what
you want to come this side? Like I'm here. I've got radio mic. If you want
Who's the radio mic?
I'm on radio mic.
Do we have a hand mic? Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. I'll start here, just for time. Just a wonderful example of how actually all this is put together. And thank you for sharing with us the Foresight Review, because I chaired that Foresight Review, and that was a traditional Foresight Review with all these academics, and we were then confronted with people like Andrea, and there were some very big leaps we had to make as scientists in order to really, thank you, understand what you have to do nowadays in order to take real scientific evidence, convert it into policy, and make it something that the public can then relate to, as well as making policies that work. And I have to say that many people from the Institute of Aging actually worked on that Foresight Review, so I'm sure many of you saw things that you had contributed to, and now you understand where actually it went. And yesterday I was at the meeting of the Aging Challenge, which is now part of the Industrial Challenge. So there are 4 big themes in the Industrial Challenge, and from the Foresight Review, through wonderful work that Andrea's Policy Lab and the Cabinet Office have done, it is now part of the Industrial Challenge. So as an academic, it's really rewarding to see that. But let's open it up for questions, and Charles, we'll start with you.
Thanks very much. That was really interesting. So I've got sort of 2 connected questions. So the lovely phrase you have about fail fast. Is there not a danger that your criteria for failure is sort of within your systems of thinking, and you might think you're failing, but you're not failing? And then you drew the distinction between your approach and all the way to randomized controlled trials. And isn't there a lot in the middle? And the thing that government finds really hard, which is to sort of roll something out in one council or one county or things like that, which provides fabulous on-the-ground real evidence to feed back. And isn't there a lot of really valuable stuff in the middle where you don't have to go all the way to a massive and very expensive RCT?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that both the 28 levers for change and the different kind of ladder is to make that the point that there's probably more different ways that we might work. And so rather than going for the obvious, well tried and tested, there may be new and emerging ways of working. Certainly on the fail fast, so I live in Cornwall, and one of the things at an area level, I remember being told about Cornwall was it has more pilots than Heathrow. There's something about Cornwall that is just the right size. It's not too big, not too small. It has just the right demographic. And so you end up with pilots that work for one area. Maybe the challenge people talk about often is how do you scale that in size. So there's something about, where is it good to do the small stuff? Where is it good to do the pilots? I'm sort of not advocating one or other, but I do think we need to be open to this broader approach, if you like, that allows us to test out things in new ways, and particularly to be willing to get it wrong and then adapt. I did some work some years ago on R&D in different sectors, so not government, but in different sectors. And of course, the thing that I didn't realise before I did the research was the length of R&D very much varies depending on the sector. So if you're in the whiskey industry, I think it's like 24 years, but if you're in Tech City, it might be 24 hours. So also recognising that some of the challenges, if you like, that government deal with have these long timescales, long horizons, and then probably less adept at some of that rapid digital evolution. And I mean, today, the Government Digital Service doing a lot of work on Sprint 18, and that's brought, again, a whole new toolkit, if you like, to government.
Okay. Yes, man there, and then we'll go to the man in the blue shirt.
And thank you so much for that talk. That was wonderful. And I've got so many questions about your methodology that I'm just going to follow up afterwards. What I wanted to ask about was to link back to your introduction about populism, actually, because it strikes me that underlying this is a shift of power. It's a shift of power from the government as knowing and understanding to actually saying, no, we don't know. We're going to ask you, which is great. But then if you're a politician, that takes away both quite a lot of your own sense of who you are and your pitch to the voters, because your pitch to the voters is now I don't know and I'm going to ask you, which maybe is at the least a different dynamic. So how have you thought about, do you have any advice about how to pitch this to a set of people whose definition is that they've got the power and the authority?
Yeah, it certainly is a shift in power. It's also opening up. So the Cabinet Secretary, for example, talks about the fact that policymakers don't have a monopoly on wisdom. And so therefore being willing to open up a policy area and get different insights from different groups, and they may be experts, but they also may be citizens, is a way of strengthening, not a way of diminishing. I think that, I was going to mention it before, but a lot of the work that the Royal Society of Arts have been doing around think like a system, act like an entrepreneur, is about recognising there's a balance between the kind of big picture change and then the actionable piece. So I think they also similarly are really interested in how you can give more voice and more influence more broadly. There's some talk, I think, in America about not the current president, but a previous one that Jeff Mulgan talked about, where he was lobbied by a group about women's particular issues, and he said, I totally agree with you, now go make me do it. And that was all about acknowledging, and they were a bit puzzled by this, but the point was that actually, whether it's Chomsky or anybody, the political powers are enabled by the public, so there is the ultimate co-design, if you like, happens in Parliament, and what we're trying to do is bring evidence to bear on that and interacting in new ways. We're often surprised by what we find out. People go in with certain expectations, and we usually come out with a better question. So we always talk about the first question being wrong, but you have to start with a question, and then using that, being willing to go out and meet people and engage, you come back to with a new question. Matthew talked about the fact that in the old days, Matthew Taylor at the RSA, they didn't have, in the early days, that a sort of manifesto had no policies. And of course now, we have a circumstance where we have detailed policies. And so there has to be a mechanism, if you like, where over time, those policies can be tested and evolve, and that happens both within Parliament, but then also within the policy process as new evidence comes to bear.
Okay, thank you. So we have a man over there, and then we have two people at the back. Start.
Thanks. Wonderful to see these techniques being used at the heart of government. I realise from what you've just said that I'm now going to ask the wrong question, because it's the first question, my first question. What areas of political dogma do you think really you need to really focus your techniques on next?
I don't know. I mean, so for example, at the moment, we're very responsive. So policy teams come to the lab if they think the current way they work is not going to deliver better outcomes. So it's often the case that their tried and tested methods are not delivering what they want, for one reason or another. There are many reasons why that might be the case. So for example, at the moment, we're working with the Office for Civil Society on the future civil society strategy, so volunteering and so forth. In so many of those areas where I think that the real shift is where government probably, on the diagram, has very little control. It has some convening power, but in many areas of our lives, change happens, and the government's role is relatively small. And so therefore, there is something about government focusing on the areas it does well, but then also recognising it can have a role in supporting those broader agendas. We talk about 3 Ds, design, digital, and data science, as being very disruptive. So I think it's certain that change is, increasing. And so therefore, my personal view is that government should be as adept at innovating and doing R&D as the best private sector comparators. And it's hard to do that at scale with, 20,000 or so policymakers and 300,000-400,000 civil servants. We have a team of 8, but we try to, so we're kind of quite small in the grand scheme of things, but I think we use the power of stories
and the real-world examples of doing it on real policy to try and create a bit of a shift in the system.
So we have Delia.
Yeah, sorry, I'm going to ask about politics too, because I thought the title is The Art of the Possible, which is usually a reference to politics, and you do mention politics in one of your bullets early on, but I think it's a remarkably apolitical theory. It's a very much a social optimization. It's just a different method for getting to the most efficient outcome. And as a political scientist, I'm not totally buying it, because I don't think politicians, they have incentives to stay in office, and that's all they have incentives to do. And I think the judiciary has its own incentives, the civil servants have theirs, and so I think it's cool. I love design thinking. I think it's really neat. I think it's fantastic that the government is taking it on board, but I don't think it's factoring in the institutional constraints and incentives that really dictate what's possible. You guys are working within a circle that's very circumscribed, and then you're leaving out all the institutional constraints.
So I think, trying to find a polite way of saying I totally disagree. I totally disagree. And the reason I say that is that one of the things the lab does is it creates a space. One of the things I've been most delighted to see in that space is the breakdown of hierarchy and silos. So there are there are many examples, but we often work with ministers who will, for example, on social housing, work with our team, and we went around the whole country engaging social housing tenants, over 1,000 people, all around, we were near here, but we were all around the country. And we had a real dialogue, and we worked in new ways with the minister. So it wasn't the case of the civil service, operates in one area and then the politicians in another. I think similarly, you mentioned the judiciary. One of our early projects was looking at mediation and divorce. And it was a really powerful session that we held where we brought the judiciary, the mediators, the experts, the policymakers in the room. And it was started and framed by the policymakers saying, I haven't got the answers here. And there was much disagreement in the room, but it all happened in the room. And there's something about the revealing of the human stories and the people's stories and the lived experience that is a common thread that all of those different professions can kind of work with. So I do feel passionately that when you start from the citizen perspective, then inevitably, you're going to have these different polarized views. Our mission is always to bring those all to bear, and so opening up to academia and different points of view. And typically, as an outcome of any of one of these projects, everyone will have shifted. And maybe some become more entrenched and some become less, but they actually are in dialogue in a way that I think often doesn't happen. But like I say, we're a very small team, and these are only a few projects, so I wouldn't go anywhere near claiming that this is happening across the whole system.
Can I just pick up on that? Because what I have been struck, knowing that I'm not a political scientist, I knew nothing about this till about 10 years ago when I started doing more sort of government work. But at this meeting yesterday on the industrial strategy, there were 2 ministers there. Now, we had been working on foresight from 2014 to 2016. The civil servants have been working really hard. A lot of them had gone to the kind of meetings that Andrea had organised, and sitting there with these 2 ministers who know nothing about ageing, they introduced their concept of the industrial strategy, and the language that they were using was exactly the language that came out of the kind of things we talk about here, that went into the foresight review, that I know was on the sticky cards, etc. And suddenly it was their speak. And so for the first time, I could see how they had sort of bought into all the stuff that I had gone through with these workshops, thinking, what is this about? But the ministers are using that speak now. It was absolutely extraordinary. So I was really impressed. But we must move on. And we have another question at the back, and we have a lady at the front, and then we have a man at the back, and that may have to be it.
Thank you so much. As you are aware, some governments actually do face a lot of uncertainty or crisis, especially the fragile state. So I am wondering whether there are 3 things that you would recommend from this wonderful presentation that you have just given, because it looked quite clearly that this is something that could be very useful in the UK, maybe in the EU, but if you go to South Sudan, where government has to decide between what to do now and tomorrow because of the uncertainty. So how does someone or the policymaker apply all these wonderful presentations? So if you could say 3 or 4 things that you can recommend.
I think it probably links to the previous point about politics and the context of politics. So I know, for example, through Nesta, there is a global states of change initiative, and that's going way beyond the UK and Europe internationally. But that said, one of the things that we made a conscious decision to do was to use the UK context and design a lab and a way of working that was very fit for purpose here, but actually probably doesn't transfer naturally to other places. There are more than 200 labs around the world, most recently in Sri Lanka. So the ethos, if you like, of getting citizens in, of not necessarily prejudging, of suspending disbelief, some of the things that the UNDP report outlined. This is, quite well known internationally now, and different governments are experimenting in different ways. So for example, across Europe, many countries have worked in this way. We got inspired by MindLab in Denmark, but Germany so far has chosen not to go down this route at all. But I was in Finland last week and they are doing it differently again. So I don't think there's a prescription here, but there are principles. And I think that if I were doing it again in another country, I'd just draw on that network and work out what works for that area. And it is a mixture of all those things, the politics, the policy, the institutions, and all of that we know makes this kind of change both exciting but also difficult.
Okay, and then we have a lady at the back.
Hi, I liked what you were saying about how you deal with future scenarios and the outside and the prototypes. I got the sense that was, you sit down and you ask what kind of futures do we want and how do we get there. But I wanted to ask, how do you deal with future scenarios that we don't want and that we want to avoid? So like climate change, which might involve policies that people don't like.
Yeah, great question. The most recent one would be the maritime shipping event that we did. And in that session, we had just short of 100 people. So it was the shipping container companies, the insurers, the innovators, the whole system. And what we did with that group is we asked them to work on 2 scenarios, a utopian and a dystopian. And what was really telling from that session was we heard from all the groups that have been working up their ideas. The utopias were quite vanilla. They were just they didn't really drive the energy in the room. But the dystopias, each one created a huge amount of energy in the room, and I didn't expect that to happen. So for me, the lesson I took from that was how interesting it is. What are the dynamics of change, and whether it's fear or whether it's apocalyptic potential or whatever, that different things drive change. And what I always say to the policy teams is that they need to be alive to those dynamics. It could look perfectly straightforward on paper, but the dynamics of how different parts of the system respond are as important as anything else. So in that example, the dystopias, what would it be like, for example, if you had a nuclear ship that was autonomous and that crashed? So that captured everyone's imagination. The utopias didn't. That's one example.
Okay.
Yes.
The lady at the front.
Yes, I wanted to ask you about whether your lab is going to look at or has started looking at the housing issues, because in Oxford it's absolutely mega and it affects all our lives because we can't recruit staff to work in our hospitals, etc. It's so big and it's like one of these huge tankers. How to turn it around, I don't know. Are you going to do some work on this? Because if not this government, the next one is going to need to have a lot of suggestions.
So one of the areas we've done a lot of social policy, and housing is one of those areas. So I mentioned homelessness. We were involved in the early scoping of homelessness in order to frame up a £20 million challenge fund. And then that has gone to local authorities who are now experimenting. So our early work informed the local authorities and the local areas. We're also working on the private rental sector at the moment, and as I said in those examples, better understanding tenants' rights and how tenants feel about the longevity of their tenure. And then we're also working on social housing, which we've had to design a very... Yeah, so the private rental sector project, it probably speaks most to that. But, you know, it's a major national priority. We now have a ministry with housing in the title as a result. So, and of course it's foundational for the way we live our lives. Yeah, it's a really crucial issue. And as with all the other projects, we want to bring the citizens' voice to bear on that, which is why in all of the work, Sanjan's out around the country a lot, meeting tenants, meeting residents of social housing, for example, but also the private sector, to really understand how they might respond. I mean, I could give you an example, but it is a big political topic, but it's also one that we happen to be working on quite a lot.
And we are running out of time, but we have lots of hands. We just give the mic to two last people, because then we must finish. And that's the gentleman and then the lady in front.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrea. I thought it was an excellent lecture and very refreshing language, and it's really great to see you here. Can I turn you back to those opening remarks about the vision of living to 100 and a sort of aging population? I just wonder if there's merit or appetite in designing new policy frameworks around that sort of getting to 100. I mean, I'm speaking about, you know, diabetes, Alzheimer's, dementia, and a whole raft of other things. In a current medicine delivery system, that doesn't necessarily make those type of cures commercial currently. I just wonder where that sits, but in the wider policy framework. You know, and I'm speaking about no antibiotics for 40 years, and each medicine taking 30 years and £2 billion. These are big, big issues, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the medicines question is one probably slightly separate, but as Sarah mentioned, the Ageing Grand Challenge is part of the industrial strategy. Within that, I think the challenge around just products and services to support those people who are older is a £98 million fund. The broader fund is 300 million. But the point you make about, you know, if you're going to develop a new drug, then the R&D investment in that is huge. So that is clearly a case of where can government, you know, work best, and where does the private sector work best, and spreading that investment more broadly. The industrial strategy and industrial challenge is around not just what it's like to be older, but also how are people who are younger almost storing up you know, because of the way that they think about their own futures, the way that they live now will impact them in the future. So there's something also about how does government make people aware of some of those consequences that they might not really be thinking about, particularly around health and obesity, for example.
And indeed, at the moment, the ageing challenge at the moment is framed around the 100-year life with a very strong life course approach. So it's exactly what you raised. And then the last question.
Thank you. I wanted to pick up on, you've mentioned a lot during your talk about the importance of seeing things from the citizen's perspective, and really the most important thing about policy is how it affects people who are going to be, you know, beneficiary of that policy. And there's quite a lot of examples of where that has worked well, and the citizen perspective has been incorporated into some of the designs that you've mentioned. So I was just wondering, sort of going forward, if you see any appetite for future development of better mechanisms for involving people in those kind of policy designs, and what sort of, I don't know, things you could imagine that might exist better in future that would improve that?
I mean, there's a long history around deliberative democracy and engaging citizens. The techniques that we use are very much about putting these prototypes in the world and testing them and getting real feedback. Sometimes that's only with a few people. And one of the things I didn't mention that we do a lot of is a combination of big data and thick data. So I think we all know what big data is. You know, these large data sets, government has a huge amount of data on recipients of services. So we might know X million people receive a benefit, say. From that, we can actually pinpoint individuals, for example, to say that we might be interested in terms of how we might better support them. And then we do thick data, which is where the ethnographers go and spend time. And to put it simply, in the lab we talk about the fact that the big data tells us what's happening, and then the thick data, the lived experience, the really rich stuff tells us why it's happening. And that, again, you know, it doesn't have to be large numbers of people, but it does require that you get beyond the usual suspects, beyond the people who might respond to consultations, and you go to where they are, as opposed to expecting them to come to you. And that's true both of local government as well as central government. So we spend a lot of time trying to find people and then work with them to develop these policies in new ways.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And an excellent question to end on, as much of what you're talking about is this shift from provider to citizen, which in a way is what this whole series is looking. Before we thank Andrea, can I just remind you that next week at the same time, we're going to look at science in the media, and we're delighted that we have Fiona Fox, who is the founding director of the Science Media Centre, and she will be talking on science on the front line, getting good quality evidence into the news. But can we just thank Andrea again for